Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you, and welcome to Hadith Principles. We are studying the principles by which we can authenticate the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, so that we can increase our understanding and confidence in the second source of our Islamic revelation and teaching, the Sunnah or the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We're talking about the great efforts that our early scholars put in protecting the Hadith from any interpolation or forgery, introduction to anything from outside, so that our religion would be sent down to us intact from the Prophet Muhammad without tahrif or tabdil, any additions or subtractions from its meaning or from its words, and any distortion in its principles and teaching. And so alhamdulillah, by the grace of Allah, and secondly, by the great efforts of our scholars in every generation, we have received this valuable treasure of knowledge in the literature of the prophetic hadith. You will find that the early scholars, when there started to be division of Islam into different sects and groups and questions about the reliability of hadith, they started to really investigate every individual who is narrating the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, so that we can be assured that we only learn the hadith from reliable, trustworthy, and accurate sources. So you will find the books, which they call books of Rijal and Al-Jarh wa Ta'dil. These are the books that have the names of all of the narrators of books of hadith, things about biographical information about them and their teachers and students and their reliability. And we'll see a lot of terminology that is used, and it's very helpful for us to review some of that terminology, just very briefly, of what you would see in those books. So for example, they will say about a person, huwa thiqah, which means he is a very reliable or trustworthy person. It means they investigated him and investigated those people who knew him and knew that he was honest, trustworthy, and accurate in whatever he did. And then there are even higher terms that they would use, like imam, which means, of course, one of the greatest leaders in the scholarship of hadith, or hafid, person who has memorized or preserved literally tens of thousands of hadith of the Prophet, according to the different opinions, different amounts of hadith, but people who are obviously the ultimate source for knowledge of the hadith in their time. And so you will find that when you look at the chain of narrators, or the isnad, you find the names of those narrators, and you look them up in the books of the Rijal, or the classifications of the men and also the women who sometimes are narrating hadith. They're sometimes narrated not by men but by women. And then you will see that they are thiqah, for example, or other words of praise for them, their accuracy. Then they're considered, very reliable, and that's likely going to be a sahih hadith, unless you find some other defects. But when all the names in there are of those very praiseworthy attributes. And then sometime you might say something like, he's sheikh. And sheikh means, of course, obviously, an elder and respected person of good character, but maybe was forgetful, maybe had Akthar, had mistakes in relaying the hadiths. So they had mistakes in memory or in accuracy. And they always give the reasons. Some famous examples are that they had records of their hadith, and then there was a tragic fire. When they lost their books in the fire, they weren't able to remember accurately. So sometimes they had students before the fire, and those students are considered very accurate. Students who learned after the fire, you will find variations, and they have mistakes in narrating from their teacher that the previous students did not have. So you got to look at when that student learned, or if they learned from him when he was a young person, or if they learned when he was an elder and was perhaps forgetful and had mistakes. Then you will find that those kind of hadith might be da'if or weak. Sometimes, though, for example, you'll see that hadith, the teacher had mistakes and was known sometimes for making mistakes, but then you will find other versions of that hadith somewhere else that back that up. from other teachers and other students. And so they didn't know each other, but they both came up with the same wording. So that's going to strengthen the wording of that. So it might go from being da'if to being hasan, being a basically good and acceptable hadith, because there are different versions of the hadith that back each other. Then you'll find other descriptions of these people. You'll find like the word matruk, that we've abandoned him, we don't relate any hadiths from that person. This person is known for some reason, which may be specified. It may be specified kadab, known to lie, or kana yad al hadith, he was known to fabricate the hadiths. And if you find terminology like that, then those are going to be considered da'if, jiddan, very weak, or mawdu' as fabricated hadiths. They're not really hadiths at all, they're just made up. And so if it was that level where the scholars say, I wouldn't take, basically when they say matruk, we would never accept any hadith from that person. That means even if you find 3 of them together with the same wording, it wouldn't matter. If you had 100 of such people who all fabricated the same hadith, it wouldn't make it stronger. And so those kind of hadiths would be of the weakest that are available. And so when you find the different classifications, they don't always agree. Different ulama sometimes have different opinions about some of those scholars. And we find some of the scholars of hadith were very, very hard in their classification, while others were very, very lax. And so in general, when we find a contradiction, we like the middle. We like moderation in Islam in most things. And so if the scholar is known to be very hard and he rejects some narrator while other scholars accept him, then we will go with that. And if a scholar is known as being very, very easy and lax, and then we find other scholars who question that particular narrator that he accepts, then we're going to go with those scholars. So we like in Islamic studies in general, we like the middle road, and that is usually the safe way. We find in our books of the Rijal, go back to the time of the successors or the Tabi'in, the second generation of Islam, and especially until the 6 books, the 6 canonical books, Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawood, Nasa'i, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah. That period, first Sahaba, Tabi'in, until those books in those 3 generations. In that period of time, you will find a lot of the writing on this subject from some of the very fabulous scholars who really devoted their life, like Ibn Ma'in, who died in the 3rd century. Tarikh of al-Bukhari, he had a separate book beside his Sahih called the Tarikh, in which he talks about this subject. Who is a good source, who is a good scholar, and why he would accept the hadith of this one and not the other one. Kitab al-Jarh wa Ta'dil, Ibn Abi Hatim, Razi, and Tabaqat of Muhammad ibn Sa'ad. These are all, and many other books which are very important. After the time of the collection of the 6 books, then you'll find a lot of scholars collected every narrator in every hadith of those 6 books together in one book. And those are very important and comprehensive. Not all the hadiths are found in the 6 books. There are other hadiths found, like for example in Musnad of Imam Ahmed and other books that are not found in the 6, but the majority of hadith are. And so you'll find Al-Maqdisi in the 6th century of Islam has Al-Kamal fi Asma al-Rijal, and that is the first one that has all the hadith narrators of the 6. Then Al-Mizzi took that book, added to it, and abridged it, and added a lot of useful information. And that is one of the biggest and very useful books on the Rijal. Later, Al-Dhahabi also took that and wrote in that work, and he based it on Al-Mizzi's work. And Ibn Hajar wrote more than one book on that subject, based also, he wrote Tahdhib al-Tahdhib, which is a very big book, and then he wrote one book very available right now. Tahdhib al-Tahdhib is only in 1 volume or in 2 volumes, and pardon me, it's a very big one, and then Taqrib al-Tahdhib, which is very short. And those are all very useful if you just peruse them and just go look, for example, in one of the 6 books, look at some famous hadith, then look up the narrators. I don't know how many of us ever did that, but if you go and look up the narrators and look what is said about them in the different books, and then you can compare and you can sort of know what's the reality that's going on behind the scenes in Islamic studies that most people aren't aware of. And so our ulama up until, through the golden age and then up until the age of the completion of this work in Hadith Principles basically compiled everything you need to know about every narrator of Hadith. They don't always agree absolutely in everything, but you can look to modern scholars who write in Hadith. They will go actually looking at, say for example, Al-Dhahabi or Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, and they will see that they disagreed sometimes, and they will analyze it, and they will come up to their own conclusion. And if you study Hadith in an advanced way, also possible that you could do that, inshallah. We're going to go for a break, and we'll be back shortly. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.
Peace and blessings be on Al-Mustafa.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Hadith Principles. Before the break, we were looking at some of the classifications. When the ulama look at the isnad, or the chain of narrators, what kind of things they're looking for in the narrator. Find a pen. First of all, narrators who are considered to be really authentic, you might find words like they are a thiqah, very trustworthy, or they are a hafid, a person who is known as a great preserver, memorizer of thousands of hadith, or imam, like you say, Imam al-Bukhari, Imam Muslim, the highest level of scholarship. But to be called a thiqah by one of those people meant you were very praiseworthy. So if you will find, if you look at the hadith, and you look up the names of the people in the hadith, and you see names such as this, words such as this being used, which is trustworthy, memorizer of hadith, leader of hadith, you're going to basically determine it's probably going to be what? An authentic sahih hadith, inshallah. Most likely, it's going to be hadith sahih, unless you find some hidden defect elsewhere. Then there's the second one. Anybody can tell me some of the terminology?
Sheikh.
Sheikh. Oh, Sheikh. Yeah. Okay, what? Khata, you know, he makes mistakes, right?
Mistakes in memory.
Yeah, mistakes in memory. You find those kind of things. Yeah. Da'if, he's weak. They might say he's just weak.
Not true.
Yes.
Not yet. Not this. This is the second level. This is basically, if you see a person like this in there, it might be a weak hadith. It might become weak. It might be da'if or weak. But sometimes it might actually not be weak at all. How do we know? Because we find some maybe other hadiths that back it up. So maybe you find in this narration of the hadith somebody who made mistakes. But making mistakes, you mean he was always making mistakes? No. So maybe you find another version elsewhere that backs it up, that he actually, so this hadith might actually be a Hasan hadith. It's not a da'if hadith. And then the third, this is the lowest, when you find these words used about people, you would never accept the hadiths from them. So they might say, what?
Matruk.
Matruk, that means basically, we don't accept hadith from this person at all. They gave up. They don't listen to his narration no matter what. Or he...
وضاع أو كذاب.
Yeah, kadhab, liar, you know. Kadhab is double, I'm not going to write all that. Kadhab, or a liar, or he used to make wada, or he used to fabricate hadith, or make them up. Those hadith would most likely be considered mawdu' hadiths, or very, very weak, da'if jiddan hadiths, inshallah. And so it's kind of important to know those terminology and what they tell you. And it's very interesting just to look some hadiths up and read about those narrators and get familiar with them, inshallah.
Yeah,
Yes.
question, Sheikh. Sometimes reading through some hadith, I've seen the word Jayyid or Hasan Sahih.
Okay, now that's not talking about the person. That's talking about the hadith itself.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the person in the narration, the narrator. And actually, next time we're going to talk about those qualifications. And so what you're talking about are basically good hadiths, hadith that is on a higher level, sahih or hasan hadith. They didn't always use exactly the same terminology, especially in the early years. And eventually people, in the later era, in the era of completion of hadith studies, they sort of came to agreement about the terminology. But many of the earlier scholars had their own term. Yes?
Uh,
People that were considered kadhab, were they just regular people or were they teachers? And what were they considered? Were they still considered Muslims by the scholars?
Well, whether they were considered a Muslim or not, they were people who were spreading, obviously, they weren't just ordinary people. Like, I'm here and then I say a hadith. They were people who were teaching people, misguiding them. They were intentionally teaching hadiths which they knew were not hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so they were either making them up or they knew these hadiths were not authentic and they were spreading them and teaching them. And so we're talking about in the era where the Islamic studies was being accumulated and completed. These were scholars and teachers who were spreading misinformation intentionally. And so if they were caught doing that, nobody would ever accept any hadith they narrated under any circumstances. And so when they're known to be liars and, making it up, they were disqualified.
Sheikh, if there's a person who fabricated a single hadith, do scholars still reject all the hadith they were narrating, or?
Well, it's not impossible that a person like that you could back up their hadith in another source. But if they were caught fabricating a hadith, unless there was another source to back it up, you would never know. How would you know if all their hadiths are fabricated? You don't have a way of knowing unless you find some other reliable source who backs those hadiths up. So it puts a doubt. And so if they're the only narrator of a hadith, they have nobody else to back it up, because it's the person himself who is the guarantor of this hadith. And so when Abu Hurairah tells you a hadith, you have to have confidence in who he is. And so if you caught an unknown person, let's not name a name, fabricating a hadith, then you could never have confidence in anything they said unless it was backed up by another source. And then it would be, that hadith would be accepted, but not because of them.
As for the terms like thiqa or hafiz or imam, things like this, when a scholar like Yahya ibn Ma'in said such a narrator is thiqa, and Imam Bukhari said he is thiqa, do they have the same criterion to judge this a person, or at the different levels of?
There were different levels, and as I said, some of them were very strict, some of them were less so. And so, for example, if Imam Bukhari accepts a particular narrator because of his carefulness in those, we're going to accept that, inshallah. Maybe another scholar, we may not accept, they may trust a certain person, while other scholars do not, and they have the evidence. So there's a difference of opinion. Some of the scholars were very, very strict, and so they considered some people da'if or unacceptable, who the majority of scholars believe are acceptable. And so you have to actually know the different criteria of each of those, especially the later ulama tell us about that. And so if you read the books written by, say, like Ibn Hajar Asqalani of the later period, then they will tell us all about the different disagreements between the hadith scholars and who is really to be accepted in that particular situation, inshallah.
But I mean that the word itself, the thiqa.
Yeah, it has a very specific meaning, and in general, thiqa is a person who is trustworthy in their knowledge and their accuracy. But they have their own evidence of why they are trustworthy in their knowledge and their accuracy and in their deen, in their adala. And so they're considered a thiqa for all three of those reasons. But they might have differences of evidence for that and what makes them decide that they are thiqa or not. Do you have something for that?
I did. I wanted to know if the language and the different dialects of the scholars had any effect on the hadith or the isnad or the context of the hadith. Oh,
wow. Okay. This is something that's actually kind of unique in Islamic studies until the modern time. After the Sahaba spread out around the Muslim world, in the lifetime of the Khulafa Rashideen, they discovered that they had different dialects and that the language was starting to change, and that people in the cities now, the new Islamic cities all over the world, their language was changing. So in the earliest generation, they realized that language is evolving, and so they became very careful to study the Quran and Hadith in its original meaning and not to change the meaning according to their usage at their time. So they already were aware that there's a chance that words didn't mean the same thing. So they would investigate the meaning of what are called, the gharib, or unusual terminology that are found in the hadith that maybe weren't the common terminology, and understand their meaning. And so they did compile whole books giving us what the meanings are of particular words in the hadith that may be different than the common meaning to us today. But they didn't use, for example, the ulama who came from Central Asia, they didn't go by some dialect in Central Asia. They all tried to learn the standard Islamic Arabic, and most of them also were at a very high level of scholarship in the Arabic language, some of them higher than others, but they didn't interpret the Quran according to their dialects. That's something that actually happened in a lot of religions, that they would interpret the Bible, for example, according to their dialect in their time, and they didn't know what it actually meant. I think that the ulama made huge effort to make sure that that didn't happen, not in the Quran or in the Sunnah. Is that kind of what you were asking about, inshallah?
Exactly.
So the Islamic scholars, just to sort of sum it up, looked at every person in the chains of narration in a critical way. And they looked for their memory, accuracy, their reliability, their truthfulness, their piety, every aspect of their personality, and whether it was acceptable to take a hadith from that person or not. And that should give us extra confidence in following the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. May Allah Almighty enlighten us to follow His religion and preserve it in our lives. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.